Hello, I'm Roger Braveheart, and a very warm welcome to the 22-Minute Stories channel. Today, I'll be taking you through Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a haunting and powerful novel about ambition, loneliness, responsibility, and the terrible consequences of creating life without love or care. I'd really welcome your suggestions. If there are any classic books you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know in the comments. Okay, so, without further delay, let's get cracking. The author introduces the origin of the novel, explaining how a cold, rainy summer in Switzerland with literary companions led to a ghost story competition. Inspired by conversations about galvanism and the principle of life, she experienced a vivid, waking nightmare of a student terrified by his own animated creation. This dream became the foundation of the story. Following this introduction, the narrative opens with a series of letters from Robert Walton, an ambitious English explorer sailing to the North Pole. Walton writes to his sister in England, detailing his passionate quest for scientific glory and his deep-seated loneliness on the icy seas. His voyage takes a dramatic turn when his crew rescues a nearly frozen, emaciated stranger from a dog sledge on the ice. This stranger is Victor Frankenstein. As Victor recovers under Walton's care, he recognizes a shared, dangerous ambition in the young explorer. To warn Walton against the destructive pursuit of forbidden knowledge, Victor decides to reveal his own tragic history, setting the stage for the harrowing tale of creation, obsession, and ruin that follows. Victor begins his narrative by describing his distinguished family background in Geneva and the deeply loving environment of his childhood. His parents, distinguished and benevolent, provide him with an idyllic upbringing. During a trip to Italy, his mother discovers a beautiful, fair-haired orphan girl named Elizabeth living with a poor peasant family. Deeply moved by her angelic appearance, Victor's parents adopt Elizabeth, and she becomes Victor's cherished companion, whom he vows to love and protect above all else. As Victor grows, his family settles back in Switzerland, where he forms a close, enduring friendship with Henry Clerval, a boy of romantic and chivalrous tastes. While Elizabeth finds joy in the beauty of nature and poetry, and Clerval dreams of heroic deeds, Victor becomes consumed by a passionate desire to investigate the hidden laws of the physical world. He seeks to uncover the secrets of heaven and earth, focusing his attention on natural philosophy. At the age of 13, Victor accidentally discovers a volume by an ancient alchemist, Cornelius Agrippa. This book ignites an intense enthusiasm within him. He begins to study the works of other outdated alchemists, dreaming of finding the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life. His father dismisses these studies as useless trash, but Victor continues his research in secret, driven by a desire to banish disease and render mankind invulnerable to death. However, at 15, Victor witnesses a violent thunderstorm in which a bolt of lightning completely shatters a majestic oak tree. A learned family friend explains the principles of electricity and galvanism, which utterly discredits Victor's ancient alchemists. Disillusioned, Victor temporarily abandons natural philosophy and turns his attention to mathematics, hoping to find a more secure foundation for his intellectual pursuits. At the age of 17, Victor prepares to leave Geneva to continue his education at the University of Ingolstadt. However, just before his departure, tragedy strikes the family when Elizabeth contracts scarlet fever. Victor's mother insists on nursing her favorite child back to health, and though Elizabeth survives, the mother catches the illness and dies. On her deathbed, she joins the hands of Victor and Elizabeth, expressing her dearest hope for their future marriage. Devastated by this first experience of grief, Victor eventually departs for the university, feeling lonely and apprehensive about entering a world of strangers. Upon arriving at Ingolstadt, Victor meets with his professors. Professor Kremper, an uncouth man, harshly ridicules Victor's devotion to the ancient alchemists, telling him he must start his studies entirely anew. In contrast, Professor Waldman, a gentle and benevolent chemist, delivers an inspiring lecture on the miracles of modern science, praising the ancient researchers for laying the groundwork of knowledge. Waldman's words deeply stir Victor's soul, reigniting his ambition to pioneer a new path and unfold the deepest mysteries of creation. Victor dedicates himself entirely to chemistry and natural philosophy, quickly outstripping his peers and earning the admiration of his professors. Over the next 2 years, he works tirelessly in his laboratory, neglecting his family and friends in Geneva. Obsessed with discovering the origin of life, Victor begins studying anatomy and the natural decay of the human body. He spends days and nights in vaults and charnel houses, analyzing the transition from life to death. Through incredible labor, a sudden light breaks upon him, and he discovers the secret of generation, becoming capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. He resolves to construct a giant human being, believing his success will pave the way for future scientific triumphs. On a dreary November night, Victor finally completes his creation, gathering his instruments to infuse a spark of life into the giant body lying at his feet. By the dim light of a burning candle, he watches in horror as the creature's dull yellow eye opens, its limbs convulse, and it begins to breathe. Although Victor had selected the features to be beautiful, the reality is hideous, with shriveled yellow skin, watery eyes, and black lips. Overwhelmed by breathless horror and disgust, Victor flees his laboratory and seeks refuge in his bedchamber. He falls into a fitful sleep, disturbed by nightmares of Elizabeth turning into a decaying corpse. He awakes in terror to find the monster standing by his bed, opening the curtains and staring at him with a speculative grin. Victor escapes to the courtyard, spending the rest of the night in extreme agitation. At dawn, he wanders the streets of Ingolstadt, dreading a confrontation with the creature. By chance, he meets his childhood friend Henry Clerval, who has just arrived at the university. The sight of Clerval brings Victor immense joy and a temporary escape from his horror. When they return to Victor's apartment, Victor is relieved to find the monster has fled. However, the intense physical and mental strain causes Victor to collapse into a severe, life-threatening nervous fever. Clerval nurses him devotedly through the winter, concealing the severity of the illness from Victor's family. As spring arrives, Victor slowly recovers, finding joy in nature once more. Clerval presents him with a letter from Elizabeth, who expresses her deep love and concern, sharing news of the family, including their younger brother William and a gentle servant girl named Justine Moritz, who has returned to live with them. Victor's recovery is shattered when he receives a devastating letter from his father, announcing that his youngest brother William has been brutally murdered. During a family walk, the young boy disappeared and was later found strangled in the grass. Elizabeth is consumed by guilt because she had allowed William to wear a valuable miniature portrait of their mother, which is now missing. Victor immediately departs for Geneva, filled with grief and dread. As he approaches his native town, he is overcome by fear of the changes that have occurred during his 6-year absence. Arriving at night, he finds the town gates shut and decides to visit the site of the murder. During a violent thunderstorm, a flash of lightning reveals a gigantic, deformed figure lurking in the darkness. Victor instantly recognizes his creation and becomes convinced that the monster is the murderer of his brother. Despite this realization, Victor decides to remain silent, fearing that his story of creating a living monster would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. When he reaches his family home, his brother Ernest reveals that the murderer has been identified. To Victor's horror, Justine Moritz has been accused of the crime after the missing miniature portrait was found in her pocket. Victor passionately asserts Justine's innocence, but she is put on trial. During the trial, circumstantial evidence and Justine's own confused behavior weigh heavily against her, despite Elizabeth's moving plea for her character. Justine is condemned to death. Victor visits her in prison with Elizabeth, where Justine confesses that she signed a false confession under pressure from her priest, who threatened her with excommunication. Justine is executed, leaving Victor consumed by the agonizing torture of remorse, knowing his creation has destroyed 2 innocent lives. Following the tragic deaths of William and Justine, Victor sinks into a state of deep, dark melancholy and sleeplessness. He is weighed down by an unbearable burden of guilt, knowing that he is the true source of these horrors. His father attempts to comfort him, urging him to moderate his grief for the sake of the surviving family members, but his advice is inapplicable to Victor's secret torment. The family retires to their house at Belle-Rive, where Victor seeks solitude, often spending his nights alone on the lake, tempted to drown himself but restrained by his love for Elizabeth and his duty to protect his family from the monster. Elizabeth, too, is deeply changed, losing her former joy and viewing the world as a place of vice and injustice. Desperate for relief from his intolerable sensations, Victor decides to journey to the valley of Chamonix, hoping the majestic grandeur of the Alps will restore his troubled soul. He travels through the beautiful, awe-inspiring ravines, finding temporary consolation in the powerful presence of nature. One rainy morning, he decides to ascend Montanvert alone, seeking the sublime ecstasy he experienced there in his youth. Upon reaching the summit, he gazes across the vast sea of ice, his heart swelling with a brief moment of solemn joy. Suddenly, he beholds a figure advancing toward him across the glacier with superhuman speed. It is the monster. Victor is filled with rage and horror, ready to engage in mortal combat. The creature, however, remains calm, entreating Victor to perform his duty as a creator. He points out that he is miserable and shunned by all mankind, and begs Victor to listen to his tale before condemning him, leading Victor to a mountain hut to begin his story. Sitting by the fire in the mountain hut, the monster begins his narrative, describing the confusing and overwhelming sensations of his early existence. After fleeing Victor's apartment, he wandered into a forest near Ingolstadt, gradually learning to distinguish his senses, find food, and appreciate the light of the moon. He discovered the utility of fire left by travelers, learning how to preserve it and use it to cook his food. When food became scarce, he sought shelter, but his appearance terrified an old shepherd and caused a violent attack by villagers who threw stones at him. Seeking safety, the monster took refuge in a low, dry hovel adjacent to a neat cottage. Through a small chink in the wall, he began to observe the residents: a blind old man, a young woman named Agatha, and a young man named Felix. He was deeply moved by their gentle manners and mutual affection, though he soon realized they were unhappy due to extreme poverty. Witnessing their struggle, the monster felt remorse for having previously stolen some of their food and resolved to subsist only on wild berries and nuts. He also began secretly assisting them by gathering firewood during the night, a labor that greatly astonished the family, who attributed it to a good spirit. Over the winter, the monster listened to the family's speech, gradually learning basic words like fire, milk, and bread, as well as their names. He was horrified when he saw his own deformed reflection in a pool of water, realizing the vast contrast between himself and the beautiful cottagers. As spring arrived, a beautiful foreign lady named Safie arrived at the cottage, bringing immense joy to Felix. Through the lessons Felix gave Safie using a historical book, the monster rapidly mastered the language and gained a complex understanding of human society, history, and his own tragic isolation. The monster continues his story, explaining that he eventually learned the history of the cottagers, whose family name was de Lacy. They had once lived in affluence in Paris, but their lives were ruined when Felix resolved to rescue Safie's father, a Turkish merchant unjustly condemned to death. Felix succeeded, but the French government discovered the plot, throwing de Lacy and Agatha into prison. Felix surrendered himself, resulting in his family's loss of fortune and perpetual exile to Germany. The ungrateful merchant then abandoned Felix, but Safie, devoted to her Christian ideals and her love for Felix, escaped her father and travelled to Germany to find him. This history deepened the monster's admiration for virtue and his hatred of injustice. His intellectual development was further accelerated when he discovered a portmanteau containing clothes and 3 books: Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werther. He studied these works intensely, comparing his own condition to that of Adam and Satan, feeling a deep envy of the cottagers' happiness. He also read Victor's journal of his creation, which he found in his pocket, filling him with agony and self-loathing. Desperate for companionship, the monster resolved to introduce himself to the blind father, hoping his gentle voice would win the old man's sympathy before the rest of the family returned. One day, when the younger cottagers were away, the monster entered the cottage. De Lacy received him kindly, listening to his plea for friendship. However, just as the monster clung to the old man's knees, the children returned. Horrified, Agatha fainted, Safie fled, and Felix furiously attacked the monster with a stick. Heartbroken and enraged, the monster fled to his hovel, later burning the cottage to the ground and declaring war on mankind, resolving to seek his creator in Geneva. Having finished his long narrative, the monster makes his final demand. Victor must create a female companion of the same species and deformity so that they may live together in mutual sympathy. The monster argues that his violence is the direct result of his forced, miserable solitude, and promises that if Victor complies, they will leave Europe forever and live peacefully in the wilds of South America. Victor initially refuses, outraged by the monster's past crimes and fearing the joint wickedness of 2 such beings. However, the monster reasons with him, pointing out the justice of his request, and threatening to destroy Victor's remaining loved ones if he is denied. Moved by compassion and a sense of duty as a creator, and intimidated by the monster's formidable power, Victor eventually consents to the demand on the condition that the monster takes a solemn oath to quit the neighborhood of man forever. The monster joyfully agrees and departs, leaving Victor to return to Geneva with a heavy heart. Back home, Victor finds himself unable to collect the courage to begin his loathsome task. He realizes that completing the female companion will require months of study, and that he must visit England to gather information on recent scientific discoveries. His father, noticing Victor's returning melancholy, suggests an immediate marriage to Elizabeth to restore his happiness. Victor loves Elizabeth deeply, but the thought of their union, while his promise remains unfulfilled, fills him with horror. He convinces his father to let him travel to England first, secretly planning to complete his work in exile. His father arranges for Henry Clerval to join him on the journey, and Victor departs, haunted by the fear of leaving his family unprotected from the monster. Victor and Henry travel through England and Scotland, with Henry finding immense joy in the beautiful scenery, while Victor remains consumed by gloomy thoughts and the dread of his impending task. In Perth, Victor convinces Henry to let him travel alone for a month, seeking a remote, desolate spot to finish his work. He settles on a barren island in the Orkneys, hiring a miserable hut, where he begins constructing the female creature. As the work progresses, Victor is filled with growing disgust and anxiety. One evening, as he sits in his laboratory, he begins to contemplate the terrifying consequences of his actions. He realizes the female might be more malignant than her mate, might refuse to comply with the agreement, or that they might propagate a race of devils upon the earth. Looking up, Victor sees the monster grinning at him through the window. In a fit of passion and resolve, Victor tears the half-finished female to pieces. The monster howls with despair and vanishes, returning later to threaten Victor, warning him that he will be with him on his wedding night. Victor vows not to submit, and the next night he casts the remains of his work into the sea. However, his boat is blown off course by a strong wind, and he drifts for hours before landing on the Irish coast. Upon landing, Victor is immediately arrested and taken before a magistrate, Mr. Kerwin, to answer for a murder committed the previous night. To his absolute horror, Victor is shown the corpse of the victim, which is none other than his beloved friend Henry Clerval, showing the familiar black marks of the monster's fingers. Victor collapses into a severe fever, spending 2 months in prison before being acquitted and reunited with his father. Victor returns to Geneva with his father, his health shattered and his mind tormented by the monster's threat. Elizabeth writes to him, questioning if his melancholy is due to another love, but Victor reassures her of his devotion. They prepare for their wedding, though Victor constantly carries weapons, expecting a mortal struggle on his wedding night. After the ceremony, the couple travels to a villa on the shores of Como. As night falls, Victor's anxiety peaks, and he sends Elizabeth to bed while he searches the inn for his adversary. Suddenly, a shrill scream echoes from the bedroom. Victor rushes in to find Elizabeth strangled across the bed, the monster's finger marks on her neck. Looking up, he sees the monster grinning at the window and fires a pistol, but the creature escapes into the lake. The tragedy breaks Victor's father, who dies of grief shortly after. Victor is temporarily confined to a madhouse, but upon his release, he dedicates his remaining life to revenge. He pursues the monster across the globe, guided by mocking messages left by the creature, who enjoys the chase. The pursuit leads them to the frozen wastes of the north, where Victor nearly catches his foe before the ice splits, leaving him stranded until he is rescued by Walton's ship. Back in the present, Victor's health fails, and he dies on board after urging Walton to destroy the monster. Shortly after, Walton finds the monster weeping over Victor's corpse in the cabin. The creature expresses deep remorse for his crimes, declaring that his own suffering was far greater than Victor's. He promises to travel to the farthest north, build a funeral pile, and consume himself to ashes, before leaping from the cabin window onto an ice raft and disappearing into the darkness. Reflecting on this tragic tale, I believe the book serves as a profound warning against the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and the neglect of moral responsibility. I think the author is drawing our attention to the idea that humanity must not play God without being prepared to face the consequences of its creations. Victor's fatal flaw is not just his desire to conquer death, but his immediate abandonment of his creature due to its physical deformity. I believe this highlights a powerful critique of societal prejudice based on outward appearance. The monster's tragedy is that he was born benevolent and eager for love, but was driven to violence by the systematic rejection and cruelty of mankind. I think the story suggests that we are responsible for the monsters we create, whether through scientific hubris or social exclusion. Furthermore, I believe the parallel between Victor and Walton warns us that the pursuit of glory and knowledge can isolate us from the essential warmth of domestic affection and human companionship. In my opinion, the book highlights that true monstrosity lies not in the creature's hideous form, but in the creator's lack of empathy and the world's refusal to show compassion to an outcast. Ultimately, I think the narrative serves as a timeless moral lesson, urging us to balance our intellectual aspirations with ethical duty and universal virtue, reminding us that knowledge without empathy leads only to destruction. By showing how both Victor and his creation are consumed by a cycle of revenge, I believe the text warns us of the self-destructive nature of hatred. Thank you for staying till the end. You obviously are a glutton for punishment. Please hit the like icon if you thought this video deserves it, so other people get to see it. Hopefully, the summary length for this video was about right, but if not, let me know and I will adjust it in the future. Now, YouTube have put on screen a channel subscribe icon, and below it my latest video for you to check out. See you next time.